This is America's Roundtable from Washington, D.C., a weekly radio program with leading voices from America and international thinkers representing the academia, business, media, think tanks, and the political arena. I am Joel Anand, your co-host, joined by Natasha Sardoch, economist and co-founder of the International Leaders Summit. At America's Roundtable, we are pleased to have as one of our distinguished guests this weekend, Roger Helmer, a member of the European Parliament representing the United Kingdom. Roger was first elected to the European Parliament in 1999 and has been kept very busy ever since, representing the interests of his 4.1 million constituents from the East Midlands area. During the course of his long business career before 1999, he spent a total of 12 years running businesses in East and Southeast Asia as a resident, so he brings a wealth of detailed information and knowledge of the region to his work on his interparliamentary delegations. Roger has published 2 books on European issues, Straight Talking on Europe in 2000, followed by A Declaration of Independence in 2002. Roger, it is great to have you join us on America's Table. Welcome.
Hello, Roger.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
Great, terrific. In fact, Roger, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel told lawmakers in the National Parliament in Berlin this past week that budget talks slated for a summit that will take place may slide into next year. And some of the reasons are that France is rejecting farm subsidies and the UK is demanding a spending cut. And also you've stated that currently 75% of UK laws are created by an unaccountable institution or institutions in Brussels, and that the UK economic recovery is threatened by bureaucracy and red tape. Could you kindly elaborate and share with our listeners on America's Roundtable your concerns about the future of the UK in light of this statement?
Okay, fine. I'm happy to do that. The problem with the European Union and for Britain in the European Union, I firmly believe that our membership of the European Union is making us poorer and less democratic and less free. The costs of membership, not just the direct budget contributions, but the massive regulatory costs, have been credibly estimated at up to 10% of GDP. Now, when you look at the sort of economic situation that European countries, including Britain, are facing at the moment, we're on our backs economically. We desperately need growth. We desperately need economic recovery. We simply cannot afford the luxury of 10% of GDP spent on membership of this organization. And remember that the European Union is actually the slowest growth area of any major economic bloc in the world. It is in long-term relative decline. And the British people are starting to ask themselves, well, why do we want to link ourselves primarily or preferentially to this area that is in long-term relative decline when the growth is elsewhere in the world? The growth is in the Americas, North and South. The growth is in China and India. The growth is even these days, amazingly, in Africa. And yet we are tied in to this corpse of a European customs union, which is performing dreadfully badly in economic terms, but worse still, has the ultimate crisis, if you like, of this sort of monetary Armageddon as a result of the failed experiment of the euro currency.
Roger, we know that European books have not been audited for many years, and maybe you can share more details about it. Also, Bruno Waterfield wrote in the Telegraph past week that the British opposition to Brussels budget increases hardened after the EU's auditor failed to give another clean bill of health to £89 billion of spending, which were affected by so-called material error. So the European Court of Auditors reported that controls over 86% of the EU budget last year were only partially effective. Tell us more about it.
Well, this is extraordinary, isn't it? A major organization which has failed to get its accounts correctly audited for 18 years. I mean, it's rightly been said that if you were a commercial company operating like that, your directors would be in jail by now. So it is absolutely a scandal. Now they've got all sorts of excuses. Well, a lot of the money is spent by the member states, and it's very difficult to confirm how they spent it. And they quote other organizations which from time to time have had questions raised about their budgets. But it is massive, it is consistent, it is year after year, It became a scandal, and now it's almost become a joke because we know that the accounts are not going to be correctly audited. But the timing of this, just at the time when Brussels is pressing member states for a major budget increase, and bear in mind it's a major budget increase at a time when Brussels is also telling the member states that they must practice austerity as the only way of getting out of their economic crisis, and yet Brussels itself isn't for a moment considering austerity. And then we get the news right on top of that story that the accounts for the 18th year have not been audited. And this is contributing to a really important and major shift of public opinion in the UK with regard to Europe.
Right. Although the EU has started as the common market, reaping the benefits of the free trade and voluntary cooperation with the free flow of goods, capital, and labor, it transformed itself in a centralized bureaucracy. EU was founded on the ideals of free movement of people, goods, services, and capital. Today, the European Commission is coming out with directives that are passed down to the countries for implementation. What is the role of the European Parliament, and where do national parliaments stand today?
Well, the role of the European Parliament is to scrutinise the work of the Commission and to amend legislation. Extraordinary. I think we're the only parliament in the world that doesn't initiate legislation because the Commission, under the treaties, has the sole right of initiation. But you make a very important point. We in Britain were sold the idea of Europe as a common market, and frankly nobody quite understood what a common market was, but it sounded like trade and jobs and motherhood and apple pie, and we all thought that was a great idea. Today I was looking at some regulations which have the effect of telling people who own veteran cars that they must, if they've had them modernized and, for example, modern brakes put on them, they have to return them to their original condition. So you've actually got the European institutions interfering in something so specialized and narrow as the market for veteran cars, and also not understanding that even though you've got a veteran car, you still would quite like to have modern brakes in it, if you don't mind, because that's important for safety. I mean, and that's just one example that happened today. But again and again and again, from the old scandal of straight bananas, which was a genuine thing, by the way, not a Eurosceptic scare story, they are interfering in the minutest detail of the lives of citizens and countries. And frankly, the role of national parliaments, our national parliament, on all legislation coming from Brussels, typically they'll be given sort of 300 pages and 2 hours to approve it. It is simply a farce. There is no national parliamentary scrutiny effectively, so we just get what we get, and there's very little we can do about it.
As we discussed Euro crisis already at the Americas Roundtable with Brian Carney, Wall Street Journal Europe editor, he pointed out that the basic problem with the crisis is that European governments have been spending too much for too long and have been borrowing that money because they are unwilling or unable to collect enough taxes to pay for the spending. But what these countries need are profound economic reforms. Do you see that there is a political will and political courage to push through reforms through the European welfare state in the countries such as Greece, Portugal, Spain, and others, in order to firstly recover and eventually increase the rates of their growth and well-being?
Heavens, there's a lot wrapped up in that question. Can we go back to the beginning of the question and the reasons for the problem? And I agree that excessive borrowing is a major factor in the Eurozone crisis, but it's not the fundamental factor. The fundamental factor is the euro itself. The euro itself has been described as a bankruptcy machine. What you've got is a situation where Germany is enjoying the benefits of a currency which for Germany is relatively undervalued, and that is doing wonders for German exports, the German balance of payments. The Germans would like you to believe it's because they work hard and the Greeks don't bother to work, but a major factor is Germans have an undervalued currency, whereas the Greeks, relatively, have a grossly overvalued currency. And it's the lack of competitiveness in southern Europe and the fact that currencies can no longer adjust to take into account that lack of competitiveness. competitiveness. That is the underlying factor. And also the reasons that countries like Greece and Spain and Italy borrowed excessively was because the euro allowed them to do so. In the early days of the euro, international markets looked at the euro and said, well, it's a single currency, so it's a single risk, so we can afford to give German interest rates to everybody. And suddenly the Spanish, instead of having to pay 6 or 7% on their money as a fairly high-risk country, suddenly the Spanish were paying 2%. Well, what do you expect to happen when suddenly the interest rate falls below the rate of inflation? Everybody borrows, and they started building hundreds of thousands of properties, which ultimately were unsaleable. So, yes, the points you made in the early part of your question are absolutely correct, but they miss the underlying point that the euro itself is the problem, and while the euro is in place, no permanent solution can be found. Now, your second part of your question, can European countries, or will European countries, be prepared to make the changes they need to make? No, and they don't really understand the changes they need to make. They will defend their so-called European social market model to the end. And they may, on the one hand, actually fire people from the public service, which Greece is having to do because it simply has no money to pay these people anymore. But certainly, if you came to the European Parliament with a proposal to substantially reduce welfare benefits across the European Union and start running a viable economy again, then it would be rejected out of hand, because that isn't how we do things in Europe. The other point that Europe fails to understand, I mean, you and I have heard of the Laffer curve, and we know there comes a point when you raise taxes, but you don't raise any more revenue, because people make other arrangements, investment moves offshore, all the other reasons that we know about, the marginal cost of unemployment changes, and so on. Somehow in Europe they don't understand that. They've decided that you can always raise more revenue by raising tax rates. So they're trying to do that, and surprise, surprise, of course it doesn't work.
Right. Roger, we remember from the first day your opposition to the euro and adoption of the euro in Britain, which is so beneficial today because we hear British say, thank God we have not adopted euro.
Indeed, I mean, that's absolutely right. And it's amazing how attitudes have changed. Now, I can remember back in 99, well, when I got into politics, and for a year or two before that, I was engaged in the debate. And we were really regarded as eccentrics. We were out of touch. We were old-fashioned. You know, we were nostalgic for a lost age of empire. We'd failed to catch the zeitgeist of the 21st century. We didn't understand economics and what was going on. We couldn't see the benefits of this single currency, which was so obviously going to deliver savings in business transactions and certainty to businesses that would promote investment. And in fact, we did understand the economics. And yet, for a good number of years, through to 2005, 2006, I remember colleagues in the Parliament saying to me, you told us there were going to be these problems. You told us there were going to be asymmetric shocks. What's happened? The euro is doing very well indeed. And for those first 5 or 6 years, the euro did appear to be doing very well. And all I could say in response was, well, wait and see. And the fact is, we have waited and we have seen, and all the predictions that I and others like me were making 10, 11, 12 years ago have come true in spades, even more seriously than, frankly, I had anticipated.
Roger, and you recently switched from the Conservative Party to the United Kingdom Independence Party. As one of the reasons, you stated that values on which you were elected 3 times to the European Parliament are now better represented by UKIP than by the Conservative Party, which has repeatedly denied the British people the referendum they were promised on continued membership of the EU. Could you kindly share with our listeners what are the main differences between these two parties and the UKIP's efforts in winning seats in the British Parliament?
Yes, indeed. I was talking to a Conservative today whom I'd better not name, and I was saying to him, look, in our party, in UKIP, we just try to come up with common sense solutions that the citizen agrees with. And he said to me, well, I can remember being in a party like that. And I said, yes, I can remember too. I used to be a Conservative. But the 2 big issues for me throughout my political career, the first big issue has been national independence and democracy in my country. I'm in favor of trade. I'm in favor of international cooperation. Indeed, the UK is one of the most globally connected countries you could hope to find. We're members of all sorts of international organizations. But that is not the same thing as being governed by foreign institutions where we have little influence. So for me, the issue of British membership of the EU has been right at the heart of my political work. And we've always regarded the Conservative Party as being a Eurosceptic party, but clearly it isn't, or it isn't under its current leadership. It promised referendums on Europe and it never delivered them. Recently, our Conservative Prime Minister, David Cameron, has said, well, we may need to change our relationship with Europe, but he thinks on the whole the British people are better off in, so he would never support an in-out referendum or campaign to get out. He is clearly committed to membership at a time when recent opinion polls are showing the British people by a proportion of about 2 to 1 actually would vote to leave if they had the opportunity to vote to leave. Now, the second thing is the issue of energy, which I've become very involved in, the whole climate change energy debate over the last 5 or 6 years. And I am very, very worried indeed, and this is a point that will be very familiar and relevant to your listeners in America, because you in America, you have the shale gas revolution. Your natural gas in America is now, I think, about a quarter of the price of corresponding gas in Europe. The Boston Consulting Group really recently produced a paper in which they said that America can look forward to a manufacturing renaissance based on low-cost energy. The people who've been outsourcing and manufacturing in Asia, for example, are coming home to America and manufacturing in America, all because, or largely because, you have competitive energy. And similarly, if you look at China and India, they've got cheap coal, so they've got competitive energy. What we are doing in Europe, and I was saying this in the plenary chamber only yesterday, we in Europe have chosen to turn our backs on cheap fossil fuel, and instead we've decided to go for horrendously expensive and unreliable renewable energy, especially wind, but solar PV and so on, which cannot deliver the emission savings, cannot deliver the level of power that we need to run a modern economy, nor can they deliver the continuity of power that we need. So Europe is effectively committing economic suicide by giving itself the most expensive energy in the world. I was at a lunch today where a group of MEPs was discussing European competitiveness and the importance of developing European competitiveness. And their one idea for developing competitiveness was to spend tens of billions of euros on research. Now, research is a wonderful thing, but you don't solve economic problems on this scale simply by throwing money at research. You start out by deregulating. You start out by setting taxes at a reasonable level. And you start out by having a rational energy policy that can deliver secure, reliable, and affordable energy. And frankly, as long as Europe isn't doing those things, it just is not a competitor in the global economy.
Roger, just recently during the presidential elections, what we had is that we've had a discussion and a debate on subsidies to the energy industry, for example. I think Governor Mitt Romney had stated his concerns about some $70 or $80 billion being basically given to certain special interest groups or companies, and in fact government choosing winners and losers based upon subsidies. And in fact, we've had cases whereby a company in Fremont, California, by the name of Solyndra, received so many billions of dollars, and actually, at the end of the day, it went bankrupt. And so we're seeing that same problem in the European Union, whereby you have a vast amount of subsidies being sent out. And is there a return on this investment? And what are your thoughts about the future when you think about all these new fines and penalties that are placed upon businesses in light of this whole issue of concern for the environment?
Well, I thought it was remarkable that President Obama's poster child for environmental energy and green jobs was, as you rightly say, Solyndra, and it went belly up. I was reading today on a website that there are 14,000 redundant and abandoned wind turbines in America. I don't know whether that figure's correct, but That's the number I read. Yes, let me give you a statistic which I think is really extraordinary. We in Britain are building wind farms, and we aim to get, it's a ridiculous number, but we aim to get 30% of our electricity from wind turbines by 2020. And as I'm sure you're aware, if you have wind turbines, you have to have conventional backup, so we would need gas backup. Now, the capital cost of investing in the wind turbines plus the gas is about 113 billion pounds, 113 billion. That's a fearful amount of money. And the alternative, of course, would be just to build the gas and run it continuously, and you wouldn't need the wind farms at all. And the cost of just building the gas would be about 15 billion. So you're looking at spending about 8 times as much money to generate the same electricity from two sources, wind plus gas, as you would need to spend just to build the gas and use the gas. Those sorts of comparisons just show the absolute lunacy, especially given that there are several academic studies recently showing that because in the scenario I've described, the gas is run intermittently and therefore very inefficiently and therefore burns more fuel per unit of output and more emissions per unit of output than if you ran it properly. And the effect is that you don't even make the emission savings that you thought you were making, because you may produce less electricity from your gas-fired turbines, but you actually burn more gas doing so because you're running them very inefficiently. I mean, it is just lunacy. And the amount of money that is going into these subsidies, and of course, you generate a whole army, an industry of rent seekers. There's a book recently been published by a very prominent environmental economist who's a professor at Oxford, a chap called Dieter Helm, who's got a CV as long as your arm and has advised the government and so on. And he came up with a wonderful phrase. He said, the renewables industry is an orgy of rent seekers. And that's exactly what it is. And you get these business executives coming forward and saying, oh, we must have a clear commitment to green energy. And you know all they're really asking for is subsidies.
Right, indeed. This is America's Roundtable. Visit us at americasrt.com. Follow us on Twitter at americasrt. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook. Like and share.